At 65, Margaret had stopped expecting surprises. Her days followed a quiet rhythm in her modest home on the edge of Cornwall, the sea breeze whispering through the hedges like an old friend. Her husband, Geoffrey, spent most of his days cycling through the countryside with other men his age, donning tight lycra and sipping energy drinks as if they were still in their 30s. Margaret, on the other hand, had long buried her own joys beneath layers of responsibility. But one morning, something changed. She passed a notice board outside the village library. A faded poster flapped gently in the wind. Painting for beginners. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Fridays. 9 to 12. Community college by the shore. £15 a session. Senior discount available. She stopped and stared. For a moment, time seemed to loosen its grip. She could almost smell the oils and see the colors dancing across a canvas, like old friends she had once loved and lost. Margaret had not held a brush in over 4 decades, but the memory of that feeling, of creating something that was hers, rushed back with astonishing force. That afternoon, she visited the community college. The instructor, a kindly woman named Jeanette, welcomed her with genuine warmth. "Just bring yourself, dear. Everything else is provided." Margaret signed up on the spot, her hands trembling with anticipation. Later that evening, she shared the news with her family over dinner. Her son Daniel and his wife Chloe had come over with their 3-year-old boy, Alfie, who was merrily mashing peas into the tablecloth. "I've enrolled in an art class," she said, her voice carrying a rare hint of excitement. "Just down by the beach. Starts next week. 3 mornings a week." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Mum, £15 a class. That adds up. Have you calculated how much that is a month?" Chloe did not even look up from her phone. "And who's going to watch Alfie while you're off playing with paint? We both work full-time, remember?" Margaret's smile faded slightly. "The class fits perfectly around Alfie's preschool schedule. I've checked. But what if something comes up?" Chloe pressed, her tone growing sharper. "What if the nursery needs to call someone and you're off chasing watercolors?" Daniel added, more gently, "The economy's tight, Mum. Maybe this money would be better spent on Alfie's future. We're thinking of enrolling him in a private coding course." Margaret looked at him. "You spend £200 an hour on those camps. My entire course costs less than one of Alfie's sessions." Daniel gave a short laugh. "Mum, this isn't the same. He's a child. He's growing. What's the point for you?" She glanced at Geoffrey, silently hoping for support. He looked up from his soup, his brow already furrowed. "You're 65, he muttered. "What are you trying to prove?" "I'm not trying to prove anything. I just want to paint." Geoffrey slammed his spoon onto the table, splashing broth across the tablecloth. "Well, if you go ahead with this nonsense, you can forget living under this roof. I've had enough of your little whims." Margaret sat still. The storm swirled around her, but inside she felt oddly calm. Something had awakened in her. Something that had been sleeping for far too long. She stood up quietly, cleared her plate, and walked to the sink. No more words. Not tonight. But in her heart, a spark had been lit. The next morning, the light outside was pale and hesitant, as if unsure whether to commit to the day. Margaret sat by the window with a lukewarm cup of tea, the argument from the night before still clinging to the air like fog over the moors. Geoffrey had already gone out, his bicycle wheels crunching down the gravel drive before sunrise. She did not miss the silence he left behind. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. One line. Cancelled the class and got the refund sorted. For a moment, Margaret could not breathe. She opened the college website. Her name, once proudly sitting under enrolled students, had vanished. No call. No permission. No discussion. He had done it behind her back. He had taken what little she had chosen for herself and erased it as though it had never mattered. She clutched her tea tighter. A quiet, trembling fury began to rise in her chest. Margaret changed out of her dressing gown, brushed her hair, and put on her coat. The air outside was cold and damp, but she walked with purpose. It took her less than 15 minutes to reach the college office. Jeanette, the painting instructor, looked up in surprise as Margaret entered. "Oh, I thought we might see you next week. Everything all right?" "I need to check something," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My class registration." Jeanette's brow creased as she turned to the computer. "Oh. It says your place was cancelled yesterday afternoon. The payment was refunded." "To whom?" There was a pause. Then Jeanette said gently, "The name on the refund is Daniel Alton." Margaret closed her eyes for just a second. She thanked Jeanette, asked if the place could still be held, and stepped outside. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her mobile and rang Daniel. He picked up after 2 rings. "Mum. Where's the money?" she asked, her tone flat. There was a pause. "I used it," he replied cautiously. "Chloe's necklace, her birthday, remember? I didn't think you'd mind." "You weren't being reasonable." Margaret's voice was low and calm. "You stole from me." "Mum, come on. You're being dramatic." "It's just a hobby. I did not give you permission. You cancelled something that was mine." He sighed. "Look, I'll sign you up for a different one later. Maybe an online thing. You can still paint, just not during work hours when we need you." She hung up without another word. Back home, she made one more call. This time to the college's finance department. By that afternoon, the money was returned to her account. Her name was back on the enrollment list. That evening, Daniel rang her again, but she did not answer. Instead, she walked down the quiet lane to the shore, the sea lapping softly against the rocks. In her hand, she held a small blank sketchpad she had bought years ago but never used. She sat on a bench facing the water and opened it to the first page. Her pencil hovered, then moved, tentative at first, then bolder. The first lines of her first drawing in 42 years. Behind her, the village lights blinked on, one by one. She did not look back. The first day of class arrived with a mist that hugged the coast, soft and damp, like a whispered promise. Margaret stood at the edge of the art studio, her heart thudding with quiet defiance. The room smelled of turpentine, paper, and something older, hope, perhaps. 10 students gathered around long wooden easels. Some chatted softly, others stood in silence, like Margaret, taking it all in. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, glinting off jars of brushes and rows of paints lined up like soldiers waiting for battle. Jeanette welcomed everyone with her warm, crackled voice. "Today we begin simple. Still life. But art is not just what you see. It's what you feel. Let that guide your hand." Margaret dipped her brush into water, then pigment. The moment it touched paper, the world outside faded. Each stroke whispered back to her memories she had forgotten. The sound of gulls on childhood holidays. The scent of lavender from her mother's garden. The light filtering through linen curtains on a rainy afternoon in Devon. Time folded and shifted. 3 hours passed like 3 minutes. At the end of the session, Jeanette walked by, studying her work. She paused. "That," she said gently, "is not a beginner's line." Margaret smiled, but said nothing. As she packed her brushes, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Chloe. "Can you pick up Alfie today?" Nursery rang, he's unwell. Margaret stared at it. She checked the time. It was nearly midday. Her class had ended exactly as nursery did. She replied simply, "I'm unavailable." Please arrange other plans. No reply came. But something within her stood taller. When she returned home, Jeffrey was already in the living room, polishing his bicycle gears. He did not look up. I hear you went back to your silly class, he muttered. I did, she replied, removing her coat. You're wasting time. And money. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. You waste £200 a session on cycling retreats, she said softly. And not once have I told you to stop. He glanced at her now, but said nothing. Later that evening, as she sat by the fireplace sketching a lone cormorant she had seen at the harbour, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Chloe on the doorstep, holding Alfie, who sniffled quietly into her shoulder. Chloe's expression was tight. He has a fever. I had no choice. Daniel's at work. Margaret stepped aside without a word, letting them in. She helped settle the boy onto the sofa and brought a cool cloth to place on his forehead. He should rest, she said gently. Chloe lingered, fidgeting with her handbag strap. I'm sorry, she muttered finally. I panicked earlier. I shouldn't have assumed you'd just drop everything. Margaret nodded, but her voice was steady. I am happy to help. But I am not invisible. Chloe said nothing, only looked away. That night, Margaret watched Alfie sleep beside her sketchpad. His tiny fingers curled in a fist, his breathing slow and warm. She reached for her pencil and began to draw again. The page filled with light and shadow, with truth and softness, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt seen. By the second week, Margaret had found her rhythm. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were no longer just days. They were her sanctuary. Morning walks to the community college felt like pilgrimages. The sea to her left, gulls crying overhead, and the sketchpad tucked neatly beneath her arm. In class, her progress was noticed. Jeanette had begun asking her to stay behind after sessions. There's something in your composition, Margaret. You place color like it carries memory. And it did. Her paintings became more daring. One showed a field of foxgloves bending in the wind. Another captured a crumbling stone wall by the sea, ivy clinging to its edges like forgotten time. She began to experiment with oils, layering textures until the page almost breathed. One Friday morning, she was focused so intently on a seascape that she did not hear her phone vibrating until Jeanette tapped her gently on the shoulder. Margaret wiped her hands and checked the message. It was from Jeffrey. I've spoken to a solicitor. We should discuss the house. She stared at it for a moment, her breath caught between confusion and inevitability. That evening, she came home to find the dining table cleared. Jeffrey sat at one end, a single sheet of paper laid before him. No wine. No music. Just the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. He looked up. I wasn't bluffing, he said, as though she had asked. If you're choosing this path, I want out. I won't live with a woman who puts herself before her family. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down. I see, she said softly. We've built this life together, he went on, his voice rising slightly. You cannot just change course. We had plans. Retire quietly. Look after Alfie. Join me on cycling trips. You've ruined all that with this obsession. She looked at him, really looked. For years, she had thought of their marriage as solid, even dependable. But now she saw the cracks that had long been plastered over with silence. The weekends he vanished on his bicycle. The birthdays he forgot. The way he had once told her she would get bored if she went back to study after the children moved out. I'm not obsessed, she said. I've simply remembered who I was before I gave it all away. Jeffrey pushed the paper towards her. I'll speak to the bank about splitting the mortgage. I'll stay with my brother until it's sorted. He stood up, took his coat, and left without another word. The door clicked shut. The hallway echoed with absence. Margaret sat in silence for a long while. Then she rose, made herself a pot of tea, and carried it to her studio corner, the small spare room she had converted last month. She turned on the desk lamp and stared at the blank canvas on her easel. And then, she began to paint. With every stroke, the fear unraveled, thread by thread. The house might soon be empty. The future uncertain. But the canvas welcomed her without judgment. And tonight, that was enough. It had rained for 3 days straight. A soft, endless drizzle that blurred the hills and turned the high street into a maze of umbrellas and puddles. But inside the art room, color bloomed. Jeanette had introduced a new exercise, portraits. A mirror was placed before each student, and they were told to paint themselves, not as they appeared, but as they felt. Margaret sat before her mirror for a long time before lifting her brush. She didn't paint her grey hair or the lines near her eyes. She didn't even try to capture the shape of her lips or the tilt of her chin. Instead, she painted layers. A soft blue, deep and steady, for quiet strength. A crack of red, near the heart, for the hurt she had swallowed too long. And golden strokes across the top, hope, not yet fully formed, but rising. Jeanette passed behind her, murmuring, "It's not a likeness. But it's true." Margaret almost smiled. That afternoon, as she packed her things, she heard a familiar voice at the door. "Mum." She turned. Daniel stood there, soaked from the rain, holding a small bag in one hand. His face was tired, his hair flattened by the weather. "I went by the house. They said you were here." Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He stepped further into the room. "I wanted to return your brushes. Alfie had been playing with them." "Sorry." He placed the bag gently on the table. She nodded. He hesitated. "Things at home are tense. Chloe's not happy. She says I made things worse with the necklace, and I suppose she's right." Margaret glanced at him, her voice even. "You didn't just buy a necklace, Daniel. You sold my time." He sighed. "I know. I thought I was helping. We're all stretched. But I didn't see that you were too." There was a moment of silence. "I've been thinking," he added quietly. "Maybe I could come to your next exhibition. If you ever do one." "I'm not painting for an audience," she replied. "But you can come." He nodded, unsure whether that was an invitation or a boundary. Back home, Margaret made tea and brought out the painting she had begun weeks ago, the wild hills above the coast, caught between storm and sun. She added small figures now. Tiny, walking along the ridgeline. A woman. Alone. Facing the wind. And she stood tall. That evening, she received a letter. Handwritten, bearing an unfamiliar seal. It was from the organizers of the West Linton Senior Artists Circle. Jeanette had submitted Margaret's self-portrait for their seasonal showcase. The letter invited her to exhibit 5 pieces. Margaret stared at the page, then slowly placed it beside her mug. She did not cry. Nor smile. She simply breathed. The world, it seemed, had begun to shift around her. Not dramatically. Not with thunder or applause. Just like the sea. Quiet. Certain. Unstoppable. The gallery in West Linton sat above a quiet bookshop, its windows steamed with breath and rain as the crowd filtered in. Soft music drifted between the paintings. Margaret stood by the far wall, her fingers loosely clasped behind her back, watching strangers stop before her work and tilt their heads in thoughtful silence. 5 paintings. All hers. Each one born from a memory. A silence. A choice. The hills of Devon in spring, flecked with wild gorse. A study of gulls sweeping across a pewter sky. The soft outline of a boy, Alfie, caught in a beam of sunlight as he pressed a crayon to paper. Her self-portrait hung in the center, unlabeled but unmistakable. Daniel arrived first. He wore his best coat and carried a small posy of flowers. He stood awkwardly beside her, not sure what to say, until she gestured toward the painting of Alfie. "He's the only grandchild I've ever painted," she said. Daniel cleared his throat. "He misses you. I see him every week." "I know. But, he talks about your paintings. He calls you the color lady. Margaret allowed herself a small laugh. "That's something." A few minutes later, Chloe appeared. She didn't approach. Just stood across the room, watching. Her face unreadable. Margaret turned away. Jeanette stepped beside her, a glass of wine in hand. "You see how they look at your work?" she said, voice low. "That means something." Margaret shook her head gently. "I'm not chasing anything. I just don't want to disappear again." Jeanette smiled. "Then you've already won." After the exhibit, Margaret didn't go home. Not to Jeffrey's old house, nor to the cold spare room she had once claimed as her studio. Instead, she took the train north. Past wind-bitten cliffs and silver rivers, until she reached a small town she had visited once long ago. There, nestled above a bakery and beside a narrow lane that smelled of salt and cinnamon, was a vacant shop front with a "letting available" sign in the window. It had wide windows, white walls, wooden floors worn smooth by time. Margaret pressed her palm to the glass. She could see it. A long table for canvases. Rows of brushes in jam jars. A kettle in the corner. Sea air slipping through the open door as students arrived, cheeks pink from wind, eyes bright with curiosity. She made the call. 1 week later, the sign was gone. And in its place, hand-painted in deep blue, "Margaret's Studio." She opened the doors the following Monday. 3 students arrived on the first day. An older man who wanted to sketch birds. A woman who hadn't painted since her husband passed. And a teenage girl who said nothing but drew with astonishing force. Margaret greeted each with the same quiet words. "This space is for you. However you arrive, whoever you are. Paint what's true." As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, Margaret sat down at her own easel. Outside, the sea rolled in. Constant. Unapologetic. Inside, the brush met the canvas. And Margaret began again. The studio had become a rhythm. Mornings filled with quiet laughter, the scratch of charcoal on paper, and the smell of turpentine. Word had spread fast. Locals dropped by with sketchbooks, tourists wandered in and left with prints. Margaret taught gently, letting her students find their own way, never pushing, only guiding. But not everything was still. One grey Thursday, as rain tapped steadily on the window panes, Margaret noticed a letter pushed under the door. No envelope. Just a folded page with her name. She unfolded it slowly. "You've made your point. But this isn't over. I want what's mine. G." No signature. But she recognized the jagged slant of Jeffrey's handwriting instantly. She stood very still. He hadn't been in touch since the solicitor finalized the paperwork 2 months ago. She had given him his half of the sale. More than fair. And yet here he was again, reappearing like a shadow cast by fading light. That evening, she walked along the coast, boots crunching over pebbles. The sky was leaden, the sea restless. She paused at the edge of the water, letting the wind tangle her hair. Jeffrey had always hated the cold. Back at the studio, the light was warm. She locked the door, pulled the blinds, and stood in front of her latest painting. It was unfinished, just the outline of a figure standing before a vast sea, back turned, coat flaring in the wind. She reached for her brush and began adding color. Deep purples in the sky. Rusted golds in the waves. Not quite storm. Not quite calm. Just transition. 2 days later, Daniel arrived with Alfie. The boy ran in first, beaming, his little hands outstretched. "Nana, I drew something." He held up a picture, a bright green house with a red roof and a woman smiling in the window. Margaret knelt beside him. "Is that me?" Alfie nodded. "You live in the painting shop now." Daniel stood awkwardly by the door, watching. "I heard about the letter," he said. Margaret glanced up. "He came to you. He called. Said you were hiding things. Asked if I wanted my half of the inheritance sooner." She frowned. "What inheritance?" Daniel shrugged. "He says you're hoarding. That the studio's worth more than you claimed." Margaret stood slowly, her voice even. "There's nothing to hoard. This space, it's mine because I built it. With time. With loss. With everything he threw away." Daniel looked at her then, not as a mother, or a grandmother, but as a woman shaped by storms he never had to weather. "I told him to stop," he said quietly. "That he's not welcome in my life if he's coming after you again." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." That night, she painted until long after dark. She finished the figure at the edge of the sea. Added detail to the coat, the wind, the sky. And then, with the smallest stroke, a second figure, distant, walking away. Not chased. Not feared. Just gone. The canvas told the truth. And Margaret, brush in hand, let it. The exhibition at Kingsbridge Hall had been unexpected. A letter, addressed formally, arrived in midwinter. The Devon County Arts Collective had shortlisted Margaret's painting "Sea Between Us" for their annual showcase. Jeanette had nominated her without saying a word. At first, Margaret hesitated. But then she thought of the girl who once sat by a fogged-up window, brush poised, unsure if her hand was steady enough to paint the world she carried inside. She accepted. The morning of the event, the town square was glazed with frost. Margaret stepped out of the studio in a navy coat and a scarf Alfie had knitted for her, crooked, warm, perfect. Inside Kingsbridge Hall, chandeliers sparkled above polished wooden floors. Canvases stood tall in their frames, lit from above like relics in a cathedral. Sea Between Us held the center wall. Visitors gathered before it, murmuring. It was the painting of the lone figure and the departing shadow. A scene so quiet, it seemed to hum. Daniel arrived just after noon with Alfie in tow, dressed in a little jumper and shoes that squeaked. "She's the color lady," Alfie announced proudly to a passing woman. Margaret smiled and bent to straighten his collar. "You've got paint on your sleeve," she whispered. "I was making a dragon." "Of course you were." Chloe arrived later, standing just within the entrance. She looked thinner than before, her eyes lined with worry. She didn't come close, but this time, Margaret didn't look away. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. Not forgiveness. But something like space. The award ceremony was brief. Margaret didn't win. But when the judges passed her, one of them paused. "You know," he said, nodding toward her painting, "we couldn't stop looking. You told a whole story without a single face." She tilted her head. Sometimes, faces distract. That evening, back at the studio, Margaret stood in the soft silence. The others had left. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained. She looked around, easels waiting for new hands, jars washed and drying, the faint trace of turpentine and tea. This place was not her escape. It was her arrival. She opened her sketchbook, drew a new page, and began again. A horizon line. A boat in the distance. A woman, no longer alone. The brush moved as if it already knew the way. And Margaret painted. Because now, she could.